Well, Alexander, thank you so much for that extremely kind invitation, which even makes me more intimidated to give this talk because it raises expectations for a set of remarks that were prepared long before I heard these morning's panels, each and every one of which contained people, scholars, each of which made important contributions and put on the table challenging arguments to relate to precisely what I'm about to talk to you about. So you may have seen me at my seat way there in the back, scribbling and trying to readjust my remarks as I learned from this morning's panels. And so if there is a little bit of incoherence here, you know the reason why. But it's not just that. It's also the subject, the question that Alexander asked me to speak about is an intrinsically difficult, which I'll get to in a second. But first, I just have to say that hearing that introduction reminds me of working with you on so many projects, Alexander, but especially that huge compendium on international security. And I don't really miss dealing with our wonderful academic colleagues and the various and sundry problems they seem to always encounter right when their papers were due to us. But I do miss working with you on that. It just would have been a complete nightmare had it not been for your wise and your pleasant and reassuring companionship and collaboration on that project. So I was very, very happy to be here, very, very grateful for the invitation. However, the subject matter, is the United States a reliable NATO ally? Well, I think the obvious answer is you can't answer that in a yes or no dichotomous way, clearly. You have to ask, is it more, is it less? And I think it would be extremely bold of me to stand up here and try to argue that it is not, in some degree, a less reliable NATO ally, if for no other reason than the one raised by Steve Sademan this morning, which is the President of the United States, who is the Commander-in-Chief, and is the figure who would, in fact, decide whether or not to honor any commitment, is Donald Trump, who is an agent of uncertainty. His modus operandi is to manipulate and play with deep uncertainty and to keep people guessing as to what his actual preferences are. He believes if there's a strategy that he has, that's at the core of the strategy. And if by reliable, we mean predictable, then of course, all we need to say is that Donald Trump is the president of the United States to answer it's less reliable than if you didn't have Donald Trump in that position, had you had a less unpredictable person. Moreover, we all, whereas we maybe are kept guessing about Donald Trump's specific policy positions in hypothetical scenarios, we are not kept guessing about his fundamental nature as a politician, which is he's an anti-institutionalist. He's a disruptor of institutions, a distruster of institutions. And since NATO is an institution, and being a reliable ally would entail having a commitment to that institution as an institution, having an anti-institutionalist at the command of the most powerful member of the alliance is not necessarily the greatest thing in the world from the standpoint of reliability. There are two other reasons that make me answer the question in a kind of pessimistic way from the standpoint of supporters of the alliance that go beyond the personality of Donald Trump. And one of them is power, which is something I've studied in international relations all my life. The distribution of power in the international system. How capable is the United States vis-a-vis its challenges? What is vis-a-vis its challenges? What is the relationship between the obligations that the United States formally has and its capacities to meet those obligations? I've written a lot about this subject, and I'm not going to tell you today what I think about that subject. I'm going to tell you today what I think the American political establishment thinks about that subject. And especially, I'm going to tell you what the experts around Donald Trump think about that subject, to the degree that we can tell. And the answer to that question is they think that China has risen to such a degree that the United States lacks the capacity to meet all of its obligations. Put in a simple terms, we could say the United States and its allies are confronting some key adversaries: North Korea, Iran, Russia, China. The ability to handle all four of those adversaries at the same time, in the view of many of the people surrounding the incoming president, to meet those challenges, the United States would require a dramatic increase in defense spending, a dramatic increase in defense spending. They believe that the current U.S. military capacity does not measure up to those challenges. Therefore, they will face an incentive to try to relieve the pressure on one of those fronts. Again, this is simply what the penumbra of expertise around the incoming president is saying, not necessarily what Donald Trump will do. So we have in place a president who prizes uncertainty, manipulation of surprise, and apparently at least has a lot of people around him who thinks that the U.S. needs to relieve pressure on at least one of these fronts. And that leads to speculation all around the world as to which one will it be, if it is anyone, and what will the United States president do? If you read carefully the press and the commentary in all of these places, except North Korea, where reading the press doesn't really get you a heck of a lot of information, but even in Iran, definitely in Russia, also in Ukraine, in Europe, and in East Asia, people see the arrival of Trump as a possible harbinger of some sort of change in U.S. policy that would lead to a break in the logjam in all four of these confrontations. So how does that relate to the question that we're discussing today, which is how reliable is the United States as a NATO ally? Well, many people around Trump have their eyesight, have their gaze fixed upon the Russia front as one where they would like, if possible, to relieve pressure. And that would mean the idea of, that you've all heard about, of trying to change the dynamic in the Ukraine war, to try to use the leverage that the Trump people think they have to push that towards a kind of settlement, to indeed move the entire European security situation in a way that would imply less obligation and fewer resource demands upon the United States. So that then immediately puts a question mark over the degree to which the United States can be relied upon always to respond to European security threats the way people in Europe would like. And the third reason, so we've got first, uncertainty agent, Mr. Trump. We have second, people around him believe that the power distribution in the world is pushing the United States to need to relieve pressure, and that pressure could be in Europe. And the third is politics in the United States, which I'm going to say more about in a bit. And that is, what will the political system, what will the politics of the United States bear? What will it sustain? And here, to my mind, you have an analogous picture to the one I just told you about at the international stage, namely a sense that the polity of the United States is not primed for big international, especially international liberal projects, that it is in crying for, demanding, to the degree that we can read its preferences, for a trimmed down, narrower, more nationally focused understanding of America's global role. There's a sense, at least among some elites, both on the far left and on the left and on the right, less so in the center, there's a feeling that the United States and its allies overextended themselves in the 1990s and the aughts, took on too many burdens, had too expansive a vision of the United States role in the world. So when Kamala Harris in this last election, in a debate with Donald Trump, spoke about the rules-based liberal international order, I can tell you right away that was not playing well with large sections of the American populace. So politically, there's a sense of a need to trim your sails. And to some degree, again, that makes the United States potentially a somewhat less reliable ally than it was in the past, and that it might have been had a different person at a different party won the election. Now, that then raises the question of when you ask whether the United States is a reliable ally, it raises the question that Professor Moore raised this morning, which is a reliable ally for what? What is the alliance doing? If the alliance is about the defense of that global liberal project that I just referred to, you have a problem in that the United States is politically much less primed to support that vision. If security is defined not narrowly in terms of territorial security, not in terms of protection against armed attack from states, but framed in terms of defense of fundamental rules, then I think it's clear that the power dynamic in the world and the politics in the United States are undermining that vision. If, however, the purpose of the alliance is thought of in more traditional terms, what you might say, pre-end of Cold War terms, then I think the unreliability of the United States as an ally has been potentially greatly exaggerated. So let me just now, having given that general introduction, which is along the lines of, yes, it's impossible to deny a certain set of reasons for declining confidence in the United States always responding the way its allies would wish. Let me give you just two more detailed arguments that push back against some of the more alarmist interpretations of the meaning of this Donald Trump phenomenon for the United States as an ally. In other words, I'm now going to suggest that if we have a relatively conservative or constrained vision of what the alliance is for, then the advent of the Trump phenomenon, take two, is less of a threat than my dear colleague, Steve Sederman, was suggesting this morning. And those two are, first of all, I think we have a kind of rose-tinted glasses as to what the Article 5 commitment means and how the United States has treated it throughout the history. So this is one area, I think, where you could find yourself exaggerating the implications of the Trump phenomenon. And the second is U.S. domestic support, separate from Donald Trump himself. Where does that stand when it comes to supporting alliances in general and NATO in particular? So let me just say a few words about those that are somewhat more optimistic from an alliance reliability standpoint, and then conclude. So first on the Article 5 commitment. Well, Steve already talked about it this morning. The key point I'd like to make here is that the U.S. position on the commitment implied in the North Atlantic Treaty has always been conditional and always had clauses of nuance in it. You'll recall, as from this morning's session, the Article 5, the alliance attack on one will be treated as attack on all, but then the alliance will consult as to what to do, and take actions that they each individually and collectively consider necessary to restore and maintain international peace and security. There was no way the United States Senate would ever have approved of any commitment that would have undermined the Senate's own capacity and right and privilege to declare war. And the key point is that the United States presidents have throughout the entire Cold War and after, but throughout the entire Cold War, used their, had never treated in practice that commitment to collective defense as sacred. The treating of it as sacred or sacrilegious to deny it is in some ways emerged as part of the partisan critique of Donald Trump himself. You began to see, as Trump began to say disparaging things about the U.S. commitment to the alliance, you suddenly saw Democrats escalating their rhetoric about how the fact that he said those things is absolutely horrific and horrible. But if you look back at the history of the Cold War, practically every U.S. administration at one point or another threatened not to defend the Europeans if they didn't do something that the United States wanted. Usually it had to do with spending more on defense, but often it was about policy moves. Truman made those threats to force Britain and France to accept German rearmament. Eisenhower made those threats to overcome French resistance to the European Defense Committee. John F. Kennedy used them to force Eisenhower to accept the nuclear test ban treaty. Nixon used those threats to pressure France regarding the Arab-Israeli dispute. Reagan used those threats to pressure the Europeans regarding the USSR Siberian pipeline. I could go on. It's not unusual for American presidents to throw question marks around their commitment to NATO as a device to coerce or persuade their allies to do what they want. In other words, if you make the Article 5 commitment a sacred commitment, you've just removed all of your bargaining leverage. So Donald Trump's obviously an extreme version. The language he uses is extreme. Oh, Russia can do whatever they want. But the fundamental impetus behind those comments is not at all a departure from standard U.S. practice. And then we need to think about, I mean, here I have the advantage of age. To me, the George W. Bush presidency was just like yesterday. I remember those days. And I remember, as Steve said this morning, NATO is always in crisis. The crisis under the Bush II administration was they didn't care about alliances. They didn't think alliances were necessary. They thought alliances were encumbrance. They even thought that the Article 5 declaration in the wake of 9/11 was in some ways kind of like meant to sort of hamstring the United States. So again, that was seen at the time. I recall conferences like this one, not in Canada, but in Europe, where the feeling was of just an existential crisis in the alliance owing to this cavalier, dismissive, anti-institutionalist, unilateralist view of the Bush administration. So I don't see the instrumental bargaining approach of Donald Trump to this alliance as an entirely novel phenomenon. So that's the first main point. I'm not denying that Donald Trump is less of an institutionalist than previous presidents, but the fundamental fact that he does not consider Article 5 sacred, but rather a commitment conditional on the nature of the threat and the behavior of the allies, that is old news. Okay, so that's sort of the easy part. The more complicated part is sort of how do we interpret this election? How do we interpret what's happening in the United States politics from the standpoint of its reliability as a member of the alliance? Donald Trump, this nationalist America firster, won a free and fair election, which feeds this narrative of a rise of nationalist populism in the United States. It feeds the narrative that maybe the United States domestically is turning away from its long-time commitment to a grand strategy of deep engagement with the world. People loosely use the term isolationist to describe Donald Trump and many of the people around him in these kinds of terms. And therefore, a sense that the sort of core commitment to alliances is under threat coming from domestic politics. There's no question that polarization in the United States, in any democracy, if it's polarized, it's going to make it a less reliable out. What happens in the United States is polarization in the legislature, in this Congress, in the Senate, has led the executive to take more and more power for itself, which creates the possibility of significant swings in foreign policy with the incoming of a new administration. We saw this with Trump and the Paris Accord. We saw this with the Iran nuclear deal, this kind of zigzagging. But I have to stress that problem is a longstanding problem that the Allies have been dealing with for 30 years and more. Most importantly, I would suggest, the polarization that you see on foreign policy has to do generally with matters that fall outside the core commitments as we've understood them since the Cold War. That is to say, this country is not, the United States can get polarized when you're talking about things like climate change, when you're talking about things like global human rights. Even when you're talking about Ukraine, it has become polarized. But it is not polarized when it comes to the core commitment to allies, which again brings up Professor Moore's question. Does the core commitment to allies necessitate a core commitment to Ukraine, or are these things separable? Is a commitment to the rules-based international order writ large necessary to have a full commitment to your allies in Europe? Because if it's the case that the more expansive understanding of interest is central to the survival of the alliance, then indeed we are in trouble, because I'm seeing political divisions with the United States on those issues. But let's take a quick look at the election, and then let me take a quick look at the nature of US support for NATO, and then I'll close. First, let's take a look at the election. There's two views of this election. One is that it's a major realignment, that it represents a fundamental step change in American politics. The other is that it's a standard change election, namely any party standing against the status quo was heavily favored to win. The fact that this was the case in almost every wealthy democracy I think, lends support to the second view. In almost every single wealthy democracy, every single OECD democracy, incumbent parties are either tossed out of office or they're very, very unpopular. So in this sense, Kamala Harris was running against the wind here in any case. And in some sense, you could say the victory of Trump would have been much more dramatic had he not been so unpopular. And that then suggests that you're not seeing some huge realignment. You're seeing a situation in which a few years from now, Trump will be the incumbent and he will suffer the curse of incumbency. Indeed, 2 years from now, he's likely to lose his razor-thin majority in the United States House of Representatives, and the tide will already be turning. He'll be a lame duck. His ability to sway things will be reduced. So again, these are two different interpretations of the election. I do think the standard change election view is far more persuasive. If you agree with me, then again, the meaning of this election for U.S. reliability as an ally is less portentous, less historical change than it is a important development that needs to be managed, but is not necessarily a step change historically in a U.S. commitment to the alliance. Just a quick couple of notes here. Yes, Trump won both the Electoral College and the popular vote, and is the second Republican to win the popular vote since 1988. Sure, but it's important to bear in mind that the margins, both in raw votes and percentages, were very, very slim by historical standards, even by recent standards. His vote margin in the national vote was 1.6% over Harris, 1.6%. Again, it's very difficult to read this as a step change, new alignment kind of election. Even his electoral college victory was a kind of standard electoral. It wasn't a super narrow one, but it wasn't a super decisive. Again, I already had a cause to mention the razor-thin majority in the United States House of Representatives. We have this term in American politics called coattails. So when the president is winning, how many of the lower down candidates across the states does he bring along with his coattails? And his coattails were not particularly long in this election. All of this is pushing against seeing this outcome in momentous world historical terms. But let me just suggest something I think more important and deeper than that, which is I think populars and elite support in the United States for its globally engaged role and for its alliances remains very, very strong. Indeed, I want to stress again, there aren't any isolationists in the United States. Donald Trump is not an isolationist. There's no evidence he's an isolationist. Nobody that's appointed or is nominated to be appointed is an isolationist. They're all vigorous internationalists. They just may not be the type of vigorous internationalists that you like, but they're vigorous internationalists. And Donald Trump has been very careful in the lead up to this election. He was very careful in the election to actually go back on and soft pedal some of the rhetoric about the alliances. Instead, he pushed this idea that the world's going to hell, I can solve it. These guys have screwed things up, I can make deals, I can make bargains. Again, it's a very different vibe than a true vibe where the election was about pulling back from the world. And the reason for that, I think, is that Trump and the people around him know that the alliances are popular. And there's two key pieces to this. I would say that, does the United States have the military capability to defend the alliances, and is the United States willing to defend the alliances? And on both of these things, there's strong bipartisan consensus in the United States. You know, that's what the most recent U.S. military budget, nearly $900 billion. That's 70% higher than it was in real terms when the president of the United States was named Dwight Eisenhower. It's about 40% of global military spending in 2024. In other words, the same percentage of global military spending that we had in the Eisenhower administration, we now have in 2024, despite the rise of China. And this is passing with huge majorities in the United States legislature. There is no candidate running on a platform of reducing defense spending. Bottom line here is we see no evidence of this kind of backing away from the commitments necessary to stay in the U.S. global role. As I mentioned earlier, we don't see any evidence of an overwhelming pressure to raise defense expenditures beyond those already sky-high levels. But there is very little sentiment, indication of an American domestic politics backing away from the defense commitments necessary to sustain its ability to credibly defend its allies. But now on defending allies itself, I mean, if Donald Trump truly contemplated rebuking and renouncing NATO, he's an outlier in the United States, and he knows it. The United States is not polarized on the question of NATO membership. Yes, Steve mentioned in a somewhat a different light than I'm about to, the unanimous votes in both U.S. houses, essentially rebuking Trump for questioning our commitment to NATO. Now, it's true that Trump could choose to ignore the overwhelming bipartisan consensus in favor of NATO. But he would be running against a very strong political tide if he were to do so, which he doesn't generally like to do. Public opinion surveys show bipartisan support for NATO. They show that it remains very, very strong. 92% of Democrats and 68% of Republicans answer and tell pollsters they think the United States should maintain or increase its commitment to NATO. Voters who identify as Trump Republicans, 61% are opposed to reducing Washington's commitment to NATO. On average, around 80% of overall voters indicate the United States should maintain all of its commitments. If you plunge deeper into the data, look at party platforms, party manifestos, party elites, what they say, what they commit to, what they tell their constituents, more finely grained analysis than simply polling data, you get the same story. It's simply not a popular position in the United States to take the view that the United States should abrogate, walk away from, or take risks with losing its allies. Indeed, the baseline support for NATO in the United States in 2024 is about exactly the same as it was during the Cold War. So in sum, I would suggest to you that the evidence from domestic politics does not support any argument that there is a change towards national populism, self-regarding America firstism, whatever you want to call it, that is fundamentally making the United States less inclined to support allies. What I have suggested, however, though, is there are changes both at the international level and the domestic level that, in my view, again, this is not my own view. I don't actually think some of these assessments are correct. My own assessments of international distribution of power are different, but there is a strong view within key American circles that the agenda that the United States and its allies made for themselves in the 1990s, in the aughts, and up until 2014, 2016, 2018, was too expansive to maintain and needs to be trimmed to a more minimalist, more state-centric, more classical security conception of what these alliances are for. My prediction is if that's where the alliance goes, the United States is likely to be a much more reliable ally than it is often portrayed. And with that, I will stop my remarks and look forward to any conversation that we have or not.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you.